Welcome back to the Star Trek convention. I'm Heather Ferris, your unofficial host for STLV 2019, and I am joined by my two awesome friends right here, Fred and Rocky, and we're going to talk about the next panel, which was the 40th anniversary.
The motion picture. Yeah, I can't wait to hear this panel.
Yeah, 40th anniversary of the motion picture. So please join us, please watch, and join us at the end where we are going to be talking about it,
We'll
doing
be
some
right
commentary.
back.
See you soon.
All right, welcome. What do you think of our cast of experts up here, right? They're pretty amazing. We have actually a lot of territory to cover and not a lot of time, so we're going to jump right into it. First of all, I'd like to sort of address the Okudas, because when you look back at Star Trek the Motion Picture, it has a very different visual vocabulary than the original series. And you folks have helped develop the iconography and visual vocabulary of several Star Trek shows. So, just on the broad look of it, how did Star Trek the Motion Picture change the visual vocabulary of Star Trek from how we knew it in the original series to when the motion picture came out?
Whenever you make a sequel, however it shakes out, the instruction, the desire, the goal is always make it exactly what it was before, but completely different. And how you interpret that, how Rick Sternbach and Carl Michelson and those people did that is a remarkable story, because they kept the bones of Star Trek, but yet they completely freshened it up.
And that brings us over to Rick, indeed, which is to say that, Rick, what was your specific role as an illustrator on the film?
What I ended up doing on the film was about a third of all the control panels and signage on the ship. So I was sort of the Mike Okuda of 40 years ago.
Right.
But I was also helping folks like our production designer Harold Michelson. Okay, helping Harold with little ideas for things around the bridge, around some of the other sets. We were reinventing, as we were going, and as I tell folks, there were so many moving parts, and you used that phrase before. The Star Trek the Motion Picture was a massive number of moving parts. It had started as Phase 2 before I got there. Okay, and miniatures were being done one place, props were being done someplace else. Up in the art department, when I finally joined, we were getting into the engine room set, which was changing by the minute. The bridge and changing things over from the design that they had going in Phase 2. We made a lot of big changes in there. And I got to witness, all of that from the perspective of the art department at Paramount. Everything else was happening around us, and I don't think any one person knew every single thing that was going on. And big thumbs up to having that film made.
Yeah, there were a lot of problems in making the film. I want to talk to Douglas for just a few minutes. This is our first and maybe only chance to have Doug Trumbull on stage. So first, let's have a big hand for Doug, because he's a legend. Doug, forgive me if we just digress for a couple of minutes and go into your past, because it'll help inform how you came onto the production and what you brought to the production. So I did some work into your background, and it was actually fascinating to learn about your dad. I guess your dad did effects work on The Wizard of Oz. Is that true? Or
yes, it is. Before I was born.
What was the kind of work that he was doing on that film? Did he do like the superimpositions of Oz?
No, my father wasn't really an engineer, and he was very talented at rigging and mechanics. And some of the things that I think he did that were most important were rigging flying monkeys, for example, which is tracks up in the ceiling of the stage and wires and midgets, and flying them safely. And that's a very risky bit of business to do on a film, is flying anybody on the stage. Someone get seriously hurt. So he did that. He worked on the tree that grabs the apple from Judy Garland, and you know,
So physical gags.
yeah, physical gags.
Yeah.
The most minor physical gag was he had a fishing rod and a monofilament line tugging the lion's tail to keep it active.
Now, in some of your early work, you worked at a graphic studio where you actually contributed to exhibits at the World's Fair, I understand.
Yeah, I worked on a film called To the Moon and Beyond for the New York World's Fair that I was the illustrator on, and that was seen by Stanley Kubrick and Arthur Clarke when they were developing 2001: A Space Odyssey. So that was my first big job in movies was working on To the Moon and Beyond, which validated to them that you can make a giant screen 70mm epic movie, not a B movie in 35mm.
And 2001: A Space Odyssey is arguably, if not the greatest, maybe one of the top 3 or 4 greatest science fiction movies of all time. And it's amazing that you had a chance to work on that film. Now, I guess you developed some kind of animatics vocabulary for some of the control panels and some of the ships. What was some of that work that you did?
Well, my first job on 2001 was doing all the HAL readouts. There were thousands of feet of film that had to represent what Hal was thinking about, because his concerns were how to keep the air fresh, how to keep the water running, and keep the ship underway, and keep the temperature correct, and etc. So there were thousands of feet of these fake computer readouts. There were actually 16mm projectors behind the set. And I had to figure out how to animate all these readouts very quickly. So that was my first task for Kubrick. And I accomplished that, and then the Moonbus model came in, which was very stupid looking. It looked like a loaf of bread, you know, white fiberglass with no detail, and Kubrick asked if I could detail it for him. And I did that. And we kind of worked at this whole technique that people in the effects industry call kit bashing, of stealing parts out of German army tank kits and pasting them on the model and then painting it and aging it down and giving it streaks of oil leaks and things like that. So then Kubrick said, okay, now Doug, you've done that, now shoot the model. I said, well, I've never shot a model in my life, I don't know how to do that. So he said, I'll teach you. So Kubrick was my mentor. I learned how to do this stuff, and I just kept moving up through the production from this menial animator to one of the tops of the effects unit to get the movie done. So it led to the Stargate sequence, which is one of the things I'm most proud of.
Well, we'll talk about that in just a second, but shooting practical models, did motion control exist at that time?
Well, it was a form of motion control. It was very early in the days, and a man named Wally Beavers, who was one of the other 4 of us, was a mechanical engineer like my father. And so he figured out this very ingenious way of doing motion control at the day. It wasn't digitally controlled motion control, it was mechanically controlled motion control. And I'm not going to spend too much time explaining that, but yeah, we had to have things moving in the movie, but they all had to be moving at a constant speed. That was the limitation that we had at the time. We couldn't change the velocity or the trajectory or movement of anything in the movie. It was all just on straight tracks.
I mean, like the visual pan in on the rotating space station is kind of a legendary moment in film sci-fi, just in terms of the way, the detail of the model and the way you swooped into it. We've never really seen anything like that before.
Well, it still holds up, which I'm very proud of.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And so you actually were getting down and doing detailing on the models too. Now, talk a little bit about the Stargate sequence, because it's really trippy. I remember, you know, this is, at the time, it took on almost a psychedelic quality, but it actually seems like an amazing composite of several different esoteric film techniques. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, fundamentally, the Stargate started out as an idea to have a slot in one of Jupiter's moons, and the astronauts could actually go through the slot in one of the pods. And we couldn't figure out any way to make a slot in the moon look good. We had storyboard drawings that looked stupid, and we had to come up with something more interesting and more beautiful. And I had this idea to take on the challenge of breaking through space and time to another dimension. You got to do those 3 things in a couple minutes. And I remembered a technique that was being developed by John Whitney on the To the Moon and Beyond film that we made, which was photography with the lens stays open for several seconds while lights move spatially in front of the lens, creating an accumulated exposure. And I thought, well, that's a really cool idea, because that's introducing the element of time into photography. And I came up with this idea of doing it dimensionally and creating the Stargate using a big machine that I had to build. It was as big as this room, but it was pretty big. To do it automatically, I had to make this thing operate under electronic controls, and the electronic controls in those days was darkroom timers and motors and gears and relays. And I had to build this machine to photograph the artwork, and I supervised the artwork. So all the patterns that you see on the walls of the Stargate are just pasted up black and white photographs of electron microscope photographs or op art or textures or moire patterns with colored gels behind them, and then that moves behind a slit, and then the camera moves toward the slit and accumulates this plane of light over about a minute exposure. And I showed Kubrick a little test of it, he really liked it, so I got the green light to build what we called slit scan.
Yeah, and it was an incredible looking visual vocabulary in that Stargate sequence, and I feel like it kind of evolutionary may have informed the Deecher Passover in Star Trek: The Motion Picture. Can you sort of trace that lineage through to when you got into the production of the motion picture?
Yeah, because I think the work that I do is an interface of art and technology. Because I'm an artist, I'm an illustrator, and I come with my father's gears and motors and stuff because I was hanging out in his workshop all these years. So the Stargate was an aesthetic accomplishment to serve a certain purpose in the movie. And it required a lot of engineering, more engineering than art actually. But you know, many years passed and I was able to do my first film, which was Silent Running, which I was very proud of.
A classic. Huey, Dewey, Louie.
Pardon?
Huey, Dewey, Louie.
Huey, Dewey, Louie. Dewey's still up there. Stand by. Working on Dewey. Anyhow, I was able to make that film, and then I also worked, just prior to Silent Running, I worked with Robert Wise on The Andromeda Strain.
Right, which is a great film, and that's where you got to work with Wise, who of course directed Star Trek: The Motion Picture.
Yeah.
So you had a working relationship with him too.
I had a working relationship with him,
Yeah.
and I knew a lot about him because I really admired his work as a director on Sound of Music and West Side Story and these kind of big, giant
Day the Earth
big-
Stood Still.
Pardon?
Day the Earth Stood Still.
Oh, yeah, fantastic. I'll tell you a story about that some other time, because I was told it was paid for by the CIA to get everybody used to the idea. Anyhow, so I was moving along as a young filmmaker, director, and having a lot of trouble in Hollywood because Hollywood didn't understand weird people like me. And I was looking for ways to make a living, and I ended up sliding back into doing visual effects. And then I worked on Close Encounters for Steven Spielberg, and I worked on Blade Runner for Ridley Scott.
What did you do on Close Encounters?
Well, Steven wanted UFOs, and we had no idea how to do UFOs, and it was quite an interesting creative challenge to figure out how to do it. And it turned out as being sources of light, very simple little shapes, but the light was shining right into the lens of the camera, creating lens flares and glows and beams of light in smoke, and some exposures in smoke and some not. And then that led to the mothership, which was designed initially by Sid Mead. And we built
The visual genius, Sid Mead, one of the great futurists,
this fantastic futurist
graphic designers.
And so, you know, he had come off. Excuse me, I'm misstating it. Was it Sid Mead or was it Ralph McQuarrie? Ralph McQuarrie helped design the mothership. It kind of came down on loan from George Lucas.
Who, went on to do Star Wars.
Yeah, did Star Wars. Anyhow, I'm losing the thread of the question.
Well, what I wanted to all lead up to is the fact that the different techniques and technologies that you had developed on previous films were all brought to bear on Star Trek: The Motion Picture.
Right. So one of the things that I was so impressed by as a young filmmaker was the multi-plane camera as used in Pinocchio. That the idea that you could have multiple layers of glass and the camera shooting through these layers of glass, and you could put different artwork on the glass and create these illusions of dimension and depth. And then that was done again on a movie called Universe by the National Film Board of Canada, previous to 2001. There was a lot of what we call multiplane photography. So it wasn't layers of glass, it was layers of exposure. So you'd have one painting in the back, one painting in front of that, one painting in front of that, one painting in front of that. And if you layered them all together, you could create this dimensional effect. So it wasn't slit scan like 2001, but you could make any shape you wanted by layering hundreds of pieces of artwork. So The whole
Did you bring multiplane onto
that was
motion picture?
multiplane for the feature cloud sequence was all airbrushed artwork on black cardboard, photographed multiple times from different distances to create this shape of the clouds.
Now, Rick, was some of these amazing sequences, and we've got clips from several sequences we're going to show.
Oh wow.
Were they imagined first in the production and art department and then sort of tossed off to guys like Doug and say, hey, this is kind of what we're imagining, how can you create the scene?
Not while I was in the office, no. I mean, again, you know, things were being done in separate places, okay? I think, you know, Harold Michelson might have, you know, gotten some storyboarding type things together, but you know, this was not something that I saw while I was there. Okay, my head was buried in my desk, you know, doing things like signage, and you know, I did a couple of sketches for Harold on the reveal of the Voyager probe. Okay, as the camera went over into the pit to see the, you know, Voyager.
You have some slides that you brought with you, I think, from the production. Motion picture.
Your able AV people should have that file.
Can we maybe pull up some of those, and you can just speak for a moment or two about those before we get to the clips, guys? Have we got? Looks like we've got it. Go ahead and start rolling some of those slides. You want to talk us through these?
Yeah. In the upper right, Mike Miner and Joe Jennings. These were the first two fellows that I encountered when I was hired on. Okay. Joe eventually went off to do Shogun, the miniseries. Okay. Mike Miner was you know, one of the first people I could relate to. You know, on a big production. He was really into science fiction. He was a good friend of Bob Burns. You know, and we lost Mike way too soon. And you know, I just missed him like crazy. Mike, you know, you can see him working with Harold Michelson there on things like the B-tank stuff from Vulcan. And, you know, I was doing a lot of very mechanical type things, but I was always talking with Mike Miner and, you know, helping Harold out with bits and pieces. Let's go to the next one. There's some of Mike Miner's storyboards. You know, I'm terrible at
Animatics didn't exist in that period, did they?
Not exactly. These were all, you know, individual boards, and I'm horrible at storyboards, but I really learned a lot from talking with Mike and seeing what he did. Next. Another major factor for me on this picture was Jessica von Puttkamer, who was an engineer with NASA. He got to be good buddies with Gene Roddenberry. And you know, after the film, I got to sit through a couple of 2-hour presentations from Jesko on the next 50 years in space. And this was 40 years ago. Okay, so it was interesting to get his take as someone from NASA on what the future might be like. Next. A lot of what Jesko contributed in terms of equations, things that we could put up on screens, ended up like on the science console. Next.
Those are the kinds of things that Doug did on some of his previous films.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. It's basically animation.
Now, a shout
And what
out.
the Okudas have done on subsequent TV series.
Yeah, right.
And we were inspired by both of these gentlemen.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, you have a spaceship and you have screens that are presenting data. Okay. This shout out to Donnie V for this CG render of the bridge set. A lot of those screens were 16mm loops, film loops. The projectors were terribly loud, and you know, we had to deal with that. And every one of those control panels, in a style that was started up by Lee Cole. She was, you know, I followed her lead in terms of the graphic styling. Next one. And you, on the right side, you can see the complexity that the backside of the bridge.
Behind the sets.
Behind the sets, all the wiring, all the motors, all the plugs and switches and things. You know, the inside of the set, gorgeous. Okay, next. We borrowed and you know, shot some very, very early computer graphic elements and then put them on these 16mm loops. Next. This is the one and only color painting that I did for Joe Jennings when I first got there. This was the engine room as it evolved, okay? We didn't have the big fore to aft plasma tunnel yet. I did this and then I really had to get on to all the other stuff that they wanted. Next. One of my cute little contributions was the overhead annunciator, which broke up long runs of the aluminum paneling that we had in the corridors. Next. Now, Mike Miner and I were looking through issues of Aviation Week magazine that I had brought in. It's an industry magazine. And Mike's looking at this jet engine compressor, and he said, why don't we put that in the ceiling?
It's an awesome, awesome set, guys.
Great idea.
It was a perfect, you know, it was the perfect inspiration. You know, multiple veins, and you know, you could hide lights up inside there for certain shots. You know, we put in the little bubble direction indicator up in the ceiling. Next. This is some of my, you know, some of my early graphics. John Cartwright did the drawing of the box, and yes, I was. You can blame me for Andromeda Strain. Next. Oh, there's me looking over some graphics. Now, again, we had no computers. I had to go across the lot to do Xeroxing. I had to walk across the Paramount lot to get Xeroxes made. We did everything old school. Pen and ink, rapidograph pens, hot press illustration board, Letraset, rub-on lettering.
It's all mechanical, there's no desktop.
It's all mechanical, yeah. But luckily for me, I learned how to do this in 1967.
Well, it's good commercial art abilities.
And you know, you can see in the turbo, okay, that was a graphic map. And behind the graphic map, there was a guy with a pen light moving. So that's how you got to the bridge. Next. Okay, this is Chekhov's weapon station, another shout out to Donnie B. And I got to design all of Chekhov's weapon controls. Now, you didn't get to see every single thing, but it was good to know that it was all there in case they needed to do close-up.
Building detail is good, and besides which the camera finds it sometimes anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Next. There's the actual set with some of the control graphics. Mike Miner and I put together some of the elements for the asteroid blasting animation. Mike took those down to the Howard Anderson facility on the lot, and they shot them on what they call a downshooter. Downshooter, right? Right down.
Animation stand.
Animation stand. So Mike wrote up what they call an animation count sheet. So every cell, you know, would appear at the proper times, and that's what appeared on Chekhov's monitor. Next.
We're running low on time, so we're going to have to kill these slides in another minute or so.
You bet. Okay. Well, let's make this the last one. The travel pod, which was that wonderful opening scene to reveal the Enterprise. These were some of the graphics that I did for the control panels, and there you can see Kirk and Scott enter the pod. I will tell the one story that I tell a lot about this. I got to work 15 minutes late one morning, okay? And you're talking $1,000 a minute shooting time, okay? I get this note on my desk. Mr. Wise wants to see you immediately. Oh God, what did I do? What did I do? I get down to stage 17 where they're shooting. And I said, Mr. Wise, I got your note. What can I do for you? And he very quietly says, come here, come on. And we go to the back of the pod. And he points to some of the panels. And he said, you designed these, right? Yes, sir. Tell Scotty what to do. And the relief was amazing. So I said, Jimmy, come on over here. Here, what you do? The first thing you do when you get in the pod, turn on the environmental systems. Ping, 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 ping. Turn on the lighting, and the stage electricians will bring the lights up. You know, and then you go to the front of the pod, and you start to, you know, hitting the flight controls and getting things ready. And Robert Wise thanked me, and I went back to work.
All right, thank you. Swinging back to Doug, I guess they had filmed a whole slew of special effects in the film, visual effects, that for whatever reasons were not good. They weren't happy with them. And so my understanding is that they begged you because they wanted your expertise on the film, and you had to come in and do like pretty well much a major fix-up of the whole film from visual effects point of view. Kind of describe how that all went down.
Well, there's a long story behind the making of Star Trek, which was that they had hired a company called Robert Abel and Associates, who were all friends of mine, who were really quite visionary visual effects people, who had done a lot of terrific film work and commercial work, and they were exploring the future of computer graphics. And they felt this is a great movie opportunity to transition into computer graphics as a tool for making movies. Very visionary concept. And sadly, it didn't work. And they went down a wrong path, and a lot of time went by, and they didn't get any shots completed at all. And the studio was panicking. This is a really important story. The studio panicked because they had taken something like $30 million in advance payments from the exhibitors to show the movie. It was called blind bidding. So the studio were being threatened by the exhibitors, you know, chains of theaters all around the world, that if they didn't deliver the movie in time, they were going to close the theaters and file a class action lawsuit against Paramount Pictures to kill blind bidding, which they really did not like. So I was in a meeting at Paramount, and I guess it was Barry Diller was leading the meeting, and there were lawyers, and Bob Wise and I and my lawyer were there. And they said, you know, gentlemen, we have got to get this movie, and we have to deliver on time, and we only have 7 months to go.
That's a lot of pressure.
It was an enormous amount of pressure, and so I was already under contract to Paramount for something else. I was doing Future General Corporation. I was exploring the future of cinema and high frame rates and simulation rides and video games.
ShowScan.
ShowScan and Magicam. I developed ShowScan there. So this was the time to strike, because I said, I really have to leave. I don't want to work here anymore, but I'll do this movie for you if I can get out of my contract. That's what really happened.
Wow. All right, we have some clips from the film. I was hoping we roll these clips. You could kind of tell us a little bit about.
I'll just talk through them, sure.
Sure. So let's go ahead and roll clip number 1. I believe this is the Klingon encounter with V'ger. Is that the?
Yeah, that's another version of this kind of multiple exposure. We had one piece of artwork on a piece of glass, and the camera would move toward it in an arc. And we'd photograph it many, many times, and it created this giant, curved, multiple exposure surface that was the V'ger cloud. So that technique was
a pretty three-dimensional look.
So, I designed that set for the Klingons too. That was kind of an interesting little project.
And then you've got a practical model of the Klingon ship.
Yeah. So the idea was to have a set with these big legs coming down that looked like some kind of compressible hydraulic legs that was like a spider, like they were inside of a spider. Didn't get used very much in the movie, but it looked really nice.
How about this whole kind of disintegration, scintillating effect?
Yeah, this was mostly done by John Dykstra's company, Apogee. And we had to come up with something that would look very threatening, that there would be this energetic, lightning-type threatening thing that would pervade the whole movie. It shows up many times during the movie at the beginning, middle, and end. And that was all actual lightning-type electrical discharges, like from a Tesla coil.
Right.
In a
Now, speaking of John Dykstra, did production feel the weight of the first Star Wars movie in terms of, well, that was such a huge success and it created such a distinct visual look?
Right.
Was Star Trek the Motion Picture, in a certain sense, a response to that and having to deal with that legacy?
Well, there were extremely high expectations, and I think that came down to the hiring by the studio of Robert Wise, who had done West Side Story and Sound of Music and Dave the Earth Stood Still, and he was comfortable in Andromeda Strain, so he was comfortable with visual effects and the complexities of that. But he was also a very operatic director. You know, they expected to deliver Star Trek the Motion Picture as this kind of epic spectacle, kind of along the lines of 2001 and Star Wars, to take the Star Trek oeuvre, for lack of a better thing, and raise it to a higher level of aesthetic beauty, mechanical engineering and design engineering to a much higher level. The visual effects had to be to a much higher level than they could ever do on the limited budget of a television series, and just upgrade everything. So there was very high expectations that this had to be achieved. And there were several false starts on the movie that went nowhere.
Let's take a look at the second clip, which I believe is the Enterprise in dry dock. Talk a little bit about that. I believe there were some issues with the Enterprise model itself because it wasn't very large and you had some detail issues with it?
Yeah, the first version of the miniature of the Enterprise was kind of the same thing I had with the moon bus in 2001. It was white fiberglass.
Right.
It had no detail. And I asked a question of the crew working on the movie initially. I said, well, this is going to go into interstellar space where there is no sun and no moon and no fill light and no key light. And I think we should make it so it lights itself up. And so we started establishing the look for the Enterprise by airbrushing, same as I did for the moon bus in 2001. Tremendous detail of these different kinds of paints and specular highlights on the surface of the Enterprise. And I directed this entire sequence for Bob because I was in charge of the sequence. And so I kind of storyboarded and designed all of these shots and figured out how to put them together. And we had to build special lenses and special cameras just to shoot this and get this periscope lens inside the dry dock and right near the body of the Enterprise.
This has got a real motion control pass feel to it, you know?
Yeah, so everything was multiple passes with, you know, to pull mats off and to be able to superimpose it with the Earth in the background and with other elements in the shot. So these are multiple layered 70 millimeters. All the visual effects for Star Trek are shot in 70 millimeters, 65 days.
It's a gorgeous sequence. We love the dry dock also. That's a great concept to have the Enterprise kind of floating inside of the dry dock and all these elements going on at the same time.
Well, I just thought it was a great opportunity to tease the audience because this is the first time the new Enterprise shows up. Thank you. So the idea was that by keeping the camera outside the dry dock for a while, so you just see the Enterprise behind all this stuff in the foreground, which was the dry dock. And then you come around and then you have this big stunning reveal of the Enterprise with all these other spacecraft flying around. And that was the moment for Jerry Goldsmith to really cut loose with the orchestra.
The great Jerry Goldsmith.
Wonderful composer.
But really the way that you flew into the ship is very operatic and again reminded me of 2001.
No, thank you. I was looking at the movie again yesterday and this morning just to kind of remind myself of things, and I realized I had a terrific dinner last night with Darren Doctorman, who I think is here, and I realized that Star Trek the Motion Picture is an opera, more than anything I can think of, and I think that I finally realized in that context why they would hire Robert Wise, because it was operatic in the same sense that West Side Story, which was a Broadway play, got transposed to the screen, or the Sound of Music, or whatever, that he brought to it a kind of an operatic directorial style. And even though it was visual effects and sets and props and locations and all the other components of the movie, it's operatic in nature. I grew to appreciate that.
And by the way, Rick and Denise and Mike, feel free to chime in as we're rolling this clip. Our third clip, I believe, is the V'ger flyby and reveal. So let's take a look at that, because the V'ger, I think, was fascinating and the subject of little controversy. That's not it, guys. There's another clip.
That's Maury Patrick.
and find, that's the final clip, but we have one before that. So let's wait a minute. Bring that up. I think some fans felt that the V'ger flyby and reveal ran too long. And I'm wondering if that's...
I don't think so. But I'll just tell you a little bit of a story to tee up the shot, is that when we realized what a challenge we had in getting this movie done in such a short period of time, there were as many shots. He doesn't have the clip.
Okay, so we have a V'ger scene that actually features Spock in his spacesuit, I'm told.
Oh, that one, yeah.
So we're going to take a look at that, and then we can talk a little bit about how you set that up with Leonard Nimoy and incorporated him into that scene, as well as the ship itself. So they're going to get that up. Thanks, guys.
So to talk about that a little bit, when I came on the production, Wise and the crew had already shot parts of the spacewalk sequence with Nimoy on wires and a couple of other astronauts too. It wasn't just him alone. And I thought it looked just terrible. And it wasn't lit right, it didn't have any anticipation of how we were going to do the effects. And so I had the grim job of going to Bob Wise and saying, I think we need to just throw all this stuff out and replace it entirely with this new sequence. So I kind of designed and directed this whole sequence, finding ways that I knew would most likely work, using the kind of multiplane photography and Stargate photography and miniature photography to put together this abstract sequence that I worked out with Bob McCall, the illustrator, space illustrator, a really good friend of mine. And he did a whole series of beautiful paintings of this sequence. And then we broke the paintings down and built miniatures of each different element here. So like that ring there is one miniature ring with lights on it, photographed many, many times, just like I was talking about earlier.
Looks like 2001.
Well, it kind of does.
It's great.
It's a trip, so and that painting was painted by Don Moore and projected onto a dome, which was exactly the same technique we used for the
That's actually a projection in there.
It's a projection of an 8x10 photograph onto a hemispheric white dome. And that we used on Close Encounters. And then this is another miniature, just a rectangular miniature photographed many, many times, and then this oblate ellipsoid shape was a miniature that we moved into very slowly. So the idea that you have to see here is that the camera is continuously moving forward, and every element is either at close, medium, or far, and we can composite them together, and it became one contiguous forward motion. That's what simplified it enough to be able to get it done in time.
And was slit scan sort of the same kind of technology that was used here?
Yeah, just straight tracks and motors and ways to do things in one continuous direction.
Okay, and forgive me, we have to keep going fast because our time is so short. We have one more clip, I believe, which is sort of the digital union of Decker and Ilea, and then the subsequent dissolve of the V'ger entity itself.
Yeah, so this sequence, these are all moire patterns that were done by Bob Swarth of, a big filter in front of the lens to create all these glows, but they're just moire patterns of, if you know what a moire pattern is, it's one pattern interfering with another pattern. And they're all designed very specifically for each shot.
There's no hand animation in there.
No, it's all done with one pattern in front of another pattern shot on an animation stand with a lens flare, a lens filter. To do all this stuff, which today we would do it with a few mouse clicks on a computer.
It's pretty remarkable at that time because it's all photographic.
Yeah, the entire movie is photographic. We had no computer graphics at all to use on the making of this movie.
It's really amazing how this went. And then the dissolve of the V'ger set itself?
Yeah, but that's all animation and superimposed and through the optical printer into the set. So we're just struggling with how to do as much as we could for as quickly as we possibly could.
It does have a little bit of the Close Encounters feel to it, right?
Well, one thing leads to another.
Right. You can sort of see the lineage there.
So there was a thing about the trouble that this movie was in, was we had to do what we would call a safe play. We would design a scene that could be done with some technique that we knew for sure would work. That's slit scan. kind of a circular version of the Stargate, that big exploding ring. That was a curved piece of tape or wire or something that just increased in diameter, which
it's another remarkable sequence. What do you think of those sequences? I mean, they're all, 4 years later, they still look fabulous.
Thank you.
They're all photographic.
Well, that's what I would call operatic. You know, the appearance of the Enterprise at the end of that shot is very operatic. It's almost like the curtains are opening on a giant stage in a proscenium theater to reveal the star of the movie or something like that. So that was the kind of operatic nature of it that I thought Bob brought to it, and I said, I get it, and I'll do that.
So then I would pose to everybody here on our panel, with the advent of computer technology and CG imaging and practical models and photographic work being replaced by computer work, what was gained and what was lost?
One of the things I think is really interesting is a few years ago, when Robert Wise Productions did Star Trek Motion Picture, the Director's Edition, visual effects supervisor Darren Doctor went to such efforts to try to duplicate the style that these gentlemen did way back when.
Darren, are you around? Where? Darren, stand up.
Stand up.
Hey, there he is.
This guy.
Darren Doctor.
Darren Doctor, ladies and gentlemen.
Anybody else want to comment on the advent of CG versus the kind of loss of the whole photographic vision?
I'll make my comment on it, and I don't want to be derogatory about computer graphics, but I will say that there's something about miniatures and optical effects that are so natural and offer so many unexpected things that you couldn't possibly think of or design into CG. And when you're working in computer graphics, you have to tell the computer what you want. And if you don't tell the computer what you want, it won't do anything more. I found that working in tanks and working with miniatures, you always get surprises, delightful surprises, that you could never think of or imagine or plan. And so I work that way to this day. I'm still using miniatures and what I call organic effects. And my philosophy is that computer compositing is so powerful today, and it's a really great tool. I use it all the time. But I restrict it to just a certain percentage of a shot. Not very much of a shot is going to be generated by a computer. The rest is going to be naturalistic miniatures or tank effects or whatever. And I just use the computer to assemble the shot instead of an optical printer. So we finally got rid of the matte lines and all the color compositing problems that we struggled with on all of these films.
And one thing that I heard from a director, I can't recall the name, but it just made me feel so good. He said, look, you don't need to see every single leaf on every single branch on every single tree. Okay? A computer could do that, but, things fall off with distance. Okay? You don't have to see every single thing in perfect sharp focus. So if you use an artistic eye with what the computer can do, I think, you're way ahead.
And I think it also brings us into a discussion about film stock versus video. Douglas, you've been a proponent of working with different film technologies and film speeds, camera speeds, but all using film stock itself. Because there's an aesthetic to film versus video, which many of us that are longtime film fans prefer the look of film stock to video imaging. And CG works a lot in the video world, but the optical effects that you work with for so many years lend themselves beautifully to film stock.
Well, my comment on that, I think it's exactly right, is that my experience in the movie industry has been that there was always an ongoing aversion to 70 millimeter because this raw stock and processing cost twice as much as 35 millimeter, a simple multiple. Very antagonistic to that, except when the movie was going to be so spectacular or the expectations so high that it seemed to justify the extra expense of 70 millimeter, which happened from time to time. When I was doing show scan, which was 70 millimeter at 60 frames per second, the problem was that it was 70 millimeter instead of 35, but it was 2.5 times as many frames. It was 60 frames instead of 24.
That's super expensive.
So that's 5 times as expensive. And then it needed a special projector. And I couldn't, as spectacular as it looked, I couldn't get any traction in the movie industry to actually...
Yeah. The theater owners didn't want to deal with it.
Nobody wanted to deal with it, even though it looked great. And I said, just pay for it and you will make so much money. It'll be successful, so just do it. But I couldn't get anyone to do it. And Brainstorm was designed for ShowScan.
A great film, by the way, Brainstorm, for those of you that have seen it. Pretty revolutionary. You directed that, right?
Yes.
An amazing movie.
So just to bring it to the day today, I've been looking at the transformation of our industry from film to digital, which we're fully there. I mean, there are still a few stragglers making movies in film, but most are being done digitally, digital cameras, digital post-production, and digital projection. And now, Moore's Law is still in full force and effect, and the cost of things that are digital, or the cost of memory, or the cost of storage, continues to decline. And so now we can do high frame rates. And I think it's fair to say that I'm very proud of working recently with Ang Lee on his movie Gemini Man.
We're all looking forward to that very much.
I'm looking forward to it too. And I've been working with Ang closely on high frame rates. And we've been shooting at 120 frames a second and projecting at 120 frames a second. I gotta tell you, the result is absolutely stunning, and the cost of it is negligible.
Peter Jackson had a lot of resistance to that. He used some of that high frame rate stuff.
He got resisted, and that came from a misunderstanding that I see that holds true with many cinematographers and filmmakers, is that they don't understand that the entire history of movies have been with mechanical projectors. These mechanical projectors and mechanical cameras have shutters in them. And the film actually gets stopped by the shutter while it advances to the next frame, in the camera and in the projector. And then we get a movie like the Hobbit trilogy, for example, which Peter did very bravely at 48 frames a second to try to get rid of some of the judder and blur and make the 3D look better. But when you approach the frame rate of video, which is 60 or 50 in Europe, it starts looking like a soap opera. So there was a fundamental rejection of it. And what they missed, and what Peter missed, and what all the studios missed, was that there's no shutter in a digital projector.
So that's where it's going to.
We're going to get there,
Yeah.
and I think you're going to see something quite different in Gemini Man.
Okay, well, I can see we're out of time, but I have to say that this has been an amazing presentation, taking a look back on all the technical aspects of the making of that legendary film.
Welcome back. Again, I am Heather Ferris, your unofficial host for STLV 2019, and I am joined by Fred and Rocky. And what did you guys think about that?
That was an awesome presentation.
Yeah, it was great.
Yeah.
The motion picture is, you're either two opinions of this movie. You thought it was stupid, slow, and boring, or you loved the hell out of it.
One of the
And
two.
I mean, is there another? Because I have no idea. I loved the heck out of this movie. I grew up watching this movie. I mean, you grew up watching Star Trek, and then you see it on the big screen. I got to see it on the big screen as a little kid. It was great. And then you see it over and over again, you know, the VHS tapes and all that. The music in this movie, the effects in this movie are amazing, especially just for the time, but just modern day you look at it and these effects are still amazing. I can't say enough good things about this movie and this presentation where they show, I mean, the actual was right there telling you, he did 2001 and all these other great films, and here's how we did this effect, and the slit scans do that, and it's a little over my head, and you know, I'm of the computer generation, and all the optical effects are friggin' fascinating that they can make this stuff work, and it blows my mind. The looks on all the things in this movie, the aliens and
The miniatures were
miniatures.
looking amazing. Everything looked amazing.
What really impressed me was the first view of the novel Enterprise.
Yeah.
That I mean, when you see the flyby where you know Kirk and Scotty are in that travel pod, they're going from the space station, you know, to the space dock, and
they're just flying around, it's so majestic, and the score was wonderful. It was some of the best cinematic starship history on the planet, as far as I'm concerned.
Another trivia fact is the opening theme for Star Trek: The Motion Picture got reused for Star Trek: The Next Generation.
Oh, no kidding.
Oh yeah.
That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, that one.
Okay.
That's where it came from.
But what was also impressive behind what they did is, as one of the panel presenters said, the special effects were actually behind schedule. It's kind of floundering.
The production of this
Yeah.
movie, you hear stories, and it's amazing it got done the way it did.
Yeah, they only had 7 months to basically pull everything together.
And there was no computer graphics. There was nothing like that. Nothing digital. No digital.
They're just
special
making
effects.
stuff up as they go along.
Everything was photographic. So
Miniatures.
The labels
Yeah.
on the consoles, they had to do that stuff by hand, and by that technology of the 70s. I mean, wow.
Yeah, that was just amazing.
It is.
And he was saying, like, it was all photographic. They just had to put layers upon layers upon layers.
Yeah.
But the way it looked was just so amazing.
It's so magical the way
Yeah.
all these analog looks, all these analog effects look. It's a magical thing that you really can't do with computers.
Yeah.
The computers are doing precise exactly what you tell them to do. Sometimes they'll do something a little weird and you keep it because it's cool. But it's not, with these analog effects, they're created in the world in front of a lens of some kind and
that's
photographed.
And that's why they were saying with these actual real things that they were working with, there's stuff that they didn't even think about. Like if they were using CG or something, they wouldn't have even thought about that. But because they're
happy
actually
accidents.
using it, right?
Happy
exactly.
accidents, yeah.
Yeah.
I think the best of both worlds, so to speak, pun intended. Yes, to probably use both CGI and real models.
Well, yeah, the technology today is incredible at compositing. But that means you're putting a layer on top of a layer on top of something. So you're taking out the background and you're putting something else in, and you're putting a spaceship on top of it, and you got laser beams flying. Compositing all those images together into one image, we can do that incredibly accurate and cleanly right now.
And cheaper too.
And cheaper, and in whatever resolution you want. You can go buy the fries and buy a couple hard drives and get it done. I mean, technology is there to make that stuff happen. But the stuff that you combine the analog world, the actual models, the miniatures. You can't do miniature spaceships like you used to be able to do them. Computers don't quite have it yet, and that's where you go back to these movies like the motion picture, and it's just fascinating, wonderful, beautiful stuff.
Yeah, definitely. And I really thought it was very interesting too. I enjoy taking pictures. I love photography. And with photography, you have to learn the manual settings, and one of the manual settings is the shutter speed. And they were talking about the shutter speed, where it's like one of those old, I don't even remember what you call it, but you have one picture and then a black spot and then a picture, and that's how they made the movie.
Oh, so you're talking about, as they developed show scan.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
The whole thing right now is, cinema has been running at 24 frames a second, and it has a flicker. It's natural to the human eye. We grew up with it. We love it.
And TV usually tries to match
TV
that.
tries to do it or make it look like a soap opera.
Right, but that way our eyes don't detect it.
Yeah. And it's so
That's what's special about
when your TV screen is running at 60 progressive frames a second, it's one image every 60th of a second. That looks like what your standard TV soap opera looks like. But can you do that and still have the film look to it? Because when you're shown a film at 24 frames a second, you're actually shown an image and then it goes black, and then you're shown an image and it goes black. But you don't perceive that.
Because of the way your eyes see.
Because of the way your eyes see it. But with the solid progressive 60 frames a second, it looks different to you. But if you do the blurring of the shutter in between, so you get an image and it goes away, then you get another image, and at higher and higher frame rates, it's harder to do, but it looks more realistic and vivid to the human eyes, with the way I understand it's supposed to work.
Right, and also too, when I'm shooting film from a DSLR, when I'm doing videography for my business and everything, we have to shoot at 1/50th of a second in order to get the actual movie-like frame rate that we're looking for. If we do it any higher or any lower, it sort of gives us a headache.
Yeah, it's tricky because you got to have the right rate, gosh, we can nerd out on this stuff all the
I
time.
know, right?
But what about the motion picture? I mean, all us videographers and cinematographers, amateurs of the world, this movie was so freaking cool back then. And directed by Robert Wise, who did, I mean, the one I go back to is Forbidden Planet. Everyone else says West Side Story. Forbidden Planet was a legendary film as far as I'm concerned as well. And people talk about how movies were slow and boring because of the pacing. But I grew up seeing a movie at that pace. It was slower, but a shot is on the screen and you're looking at it and you're thinking about it. And you're experiencing a thing right in front of you. Yeah. Same thing with motion picture. It's not as rocket, kaboom, Fast and Furious of today's style. It has majestic moves and pauses, and you're looking at these effects that you're like, what the hell am I looking at? Because it looks so strange. And it's got these blinks and probes and things. And yeah, it's a different pace, different style movie. And I dig it. I dig it.
I think it was inspired in part by the pacing in 2001.
2001, also one of those movies.
Yeah.
Of course, Kubrick had the beautiful music soundtrack set to that. Yeah. The ballet spaceship music. I mean, it's great stuff.
Another interesting point with the Enterprise model itself. Who was the person that made the comment about adding lighting? That the model was...
Yeah. It's just a flat piece of plastic. It's like a piece of gray plastic. There's no texture to it.
Right.
It doesn't look that interesting. Well, and you can't just put a big giant light in space pointing at it because it turns into a big giant piece of plastic. So it doesn't look good. So what do you got to do? Well, let's put a little light here on the spaceship. Let's put a light over here, and it lights up, and you get that shot of the Enterprise with the pools of light lighting up the ship, and it's just so damn cool.
It was dramatic. Like
it's so real when you look at it. It's like that's in front of you in space, and it's lit up, and that's a starship. I mean, come on.
And it was dramatic when they were getting ready to leave space dock. Like all the lights started turning on. And
I mean, if you want to get crazy though, you want to talk about when the warp drive fails and they end up in a wormhole. That's the weirdest part of the whole motion picture. If you want to freak out, like God, what is with this movie? That's the scene it happens because everyone's shaking and they got echoes and trails and they're talking weird and when they tell them to fire the photon torpedoes, Chekhov says photon torpedoes. I mean, I'm not going to do the whole thing, but it's crazy, and I think that's the drugs of the 70s. I can't explain it otherwise. They probably did a few drugs back then. They're doing something that was completely brand new and different at that time, and that was probably some mind-blowing stuff back then. Now we look at it and go, you know what, dubstep music is much weirder than this, and it's just not weird enough for us.
Yeah.
If you want really weird, go to a Las Vegas club. If you think dubstep is weird, go to a Las Vegas. That's weird.
Oh yeah, I really enjoyed the hell out of this panel. I really did. I nerded out. You can hear all the people that nerded out too, because when they applaud, everyone's applauding like crazy. It's all us nerdy guys with love for the cinema of the day.
The passage through the V'ger probe.
Gosh, that movie's so great.
Yeah, that part was amazing. Although I will admit, that part seems maybe a little bit longer than
it's so. It's putting you through this trip. I mean, you physically feel like you're moving through something because it's taking time. I mean, and it's the idea is V'ger was so huge. It's ginormous, and we're in this little starship compared to V'ger. So the vastness of how big that thing is, it takes a while to get there. So that's the way I feel when I look at that scene.
That's a good point.
Yeah. And then, they showed the part where Spock gets in the spacesuit and goes through V'ger and ends up, of course, mind melding with it. But they said something. They had to redo that scene.
They did.
They did the sequence
because the way it was filmed originally, it just didn't look right.
Yeah, I wonder what the actual original would look like if it's on a Blu-ray or something like that.
I've never seen the.
It sounded like it was so bad they hated it and they just got rid of it.
Yeah,
and they pasted it because the stuff they put in there was great. I mean, they got the countdown on the thing and the jetpack goes and Spock flies through the iris of the V'ger probe. It's great stuff.
Yeah, I mean when they refilmed it, Spock was basically sitting on a chair.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then they just, basically edited
They
around.
composited it in. Is what
Yeah.
of course, they did it optically, but that's a miracle in itself because it wasn't easy to optically take all this stuff together, and they're doing amazing things back then at that era, at that time. Was ILM doing that stuff, or were they doing somewhere else?
No, I think this was
Because ILM they probably just finished with Star Wars, because this is 79, right?
79.
79, 78, somewhere in there.
When it came out.
So yeah, I mean, anyway,
So
whoever did
79,
it,
it's the 40th, right?
I'm sure,
Yeah.
that
Right.
math works. I'm sure the real serious cinematic effects nerds will be all over us correcting us, because I'm
yeah.
just talking because I love the hell out of this movie.
Yeah.
And I'm sure there's guys that know exactly what they did, when, where, and how. But it was done so well.
Yeah. We're
So
geeking
well.
out.
Let's stop geeking out and get to the next
Right.
panel. What do you think?
I think it's time to probably wrap up.
That's how cool that panel was. We really loved it.
Well, thank you guys so much for joining us. Thank you for watching the panel. Thank you for listening to our commentary and everything. And join us for the next panel. And until then, live long and prosper.
Right on.